Most people think medieval peasants lived in simple huts above ground. But archaeologists just discovered something that changes everything we know about medieval survival tactics. These weren't just hiding spots, they were elaborate underground cities that could sustain entire families for months. But here's the disturbing part nobody talks about. When your heating bill makes you cry and your house feels like an icebox, spare a thought for medieval folks who turned dirt into their salvation. These weren't just desperate people digging random holes. They were brilliant engineers who figured out something modern science confirms. The Earth is nature's thermostat. Medieval Europe served up winters that would make a polar bear pack extra sweaters. We're talking about centuries when the Thames froze solid and wine turned to slush in people's cups. Your typical medieval house? About as insulated as a chicken coop made of twigs. Wind whistled through gaps like an unwelcome house guest, and fires barely warmed anything beyond your immediate eyebrows. But here's where it gets clever. These resourceful folks discovered that just 3 feet underground, Mother Earth maintains a surprisingly steady temperature. While surface temperatures swung from scorching summers to bone-chilling winters, the underground world stayed remarkably consistent, typically hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Think of the Earth as a massive thermal battery that never needs charging. During brutal winters, when above-ground structures became frozen misery boxes, these underground dugouts felt downright tropical by comparison. The soil acted like a giant insulating blanket, trapping heat and blocking the worst cold from penetrating deep enough to matter. Medieval builders didn't need thermodynamics textbooks to grasp this principle. They observed, experimented, and adapted. Families in Scandinavia dug deeper than their counterparts in milder regions, instinctively understanding that harsher climates demanded more aggressive earth coverage. Some dugouts extended 8 feet down, deep enough that even the fiercest blizzard couldn't touch them. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated temperature management techniques. Many dugouts featured carefully angled entrances that prevented cold air from settling inside. Others included multiple chambers, creating air pockets that enhanced insulation. These weren't crude caves, they were engineered climate control systems built by people who understood thermal dynamics better than they knew. The psychological comfort was equally important. When howling winds threatened to tear your roof off and snow piled higher than your windows, retreating into your warm underground sanctuary provided mental relief alongside physical warmth. These spaces became family refuges where children could play without shivering and adults could work without numb fingers. Regional climate variations shaped dugout designs dramatically. Northern communities developed elaborate multi-room complexes with connecting tunnels, while Mediterranean regions built shallower, simpler versions focused more on cooling than heating. Each design reflected local weather patterns and survival needs. Well, staying warm was just one reason medieval people embraced underground living. When raiders appeared on the horizon with considerably less friendly intentions than a harsh winter storm, these hidden dugouts served an entirely different but equally vital purpose. Medieval folks weren't just worried about freezing to death in winter, they had bigger problems breathing down their necks. Literally. Raiders, bandits, and hostile armies roamed the countryside like uninvited dinner guests who'd burn your house down instead of eating your food. These underground hideouts became lifesavers during attacks. When enemy forces approached, entire families could vanish underground faster than a teenager avoiding chores. The entrance, often disguised under hay bales, false floors, or cleverly placed stones that looked like natural landscape features. But here's where it gets interesting. These dugouts weren't just panic rooms for human threats. Medieval towns burned down with alarming regularity, sometimes monthly. Wooden houses packed together like sardines, open flames for cooking and heating, plus zero fire departments meant disaster struck often. When flames swept through neighborhoods, underground shelters provided the only escape from smoke and heat. Smart families built multiple exit routes. Why? Well, getting trapped underground during a siege was about as appealing as a root canal performed by a blacksmith. Some dugouts featured tunnels connecting to nearby wells, forest edges, or even neighboring properties. Think of it as medieval networking, but with actual survival benefits instead of business cards. The psychological aspect was huge, too. Knowing you had a safe retreat helped communities sleep better at night. Parents could tell children exactly where to run when trouble started. Villages developed early warning systems, church bells, horn signals, or designated lookouts who'd spot approaching danger. Maintenance became crucial since these shelters needed to work perfectly under pressure. Families regularly checked ventilation systems, cleared debris from entrances, and stockpiled emergency supplies. Nobody wanted to discover structural problems while arrows flew overhead. Regional variations developed based on local threats. Coastal areas faced Viking raids and needed quick access shelters near shorelines. Border regions dealt with constant territorial disputes, so they built more elaborate tunnel networks. Mountain communities worried about avalanches and landslides as much as human enemies. Archaeological evidence reveals fascinating details about siege life underground. Scratch marks on walls suggest people spent weeks hiding during prolonged attacks. Food. Storage areas show careful rationing systems. Even waste disposal was planned. Medieval folks understood sanitation mattered for survival. The most successful dugouts combined camouflage with functionality. Entrances looked completely natural from above, while interior spaces provided adequate room for families plus essential supplies. Some featured false walls hiding deeper chambers, creating backup hiding spots within hiding spots. But building these life-saving shelters required more than just fear and determination. The real challenge lay in construction itself, starting with the fundamental question of what materials medieval builders could actually get their hands on. Medieval families treated their underground cellars like Fort Knox for food. Well, if Fort Knox smelled like fermented cabbage and stored turnips instead of gold bars. These dugouts weren't just holes in the ground, they were sophisticated storage systems that kept families alive through brutal winters. The earth maintained a steady temperature year-round, hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That's warmer than your grandfather's thermostat setting and cooler than his complaints about energy bills. Grain barrels lined the walls like soldiers standing at attention. Families stored wheat, barley, and oats in wooden containers sealed with animal fat or clay. Smart placement prevented moisture damage while keeping rodents at bay. Nobody wanted to discover their winter wheat had become a mouse hotel. But here's where medieval people got really clever. They created natural refrigeration zones within their cellars. Root vegetables went into sand-filled pits that kept carrots, parsnips, and onions fresh for months. Think of it as the original meal prep, except instead of plastic containers, they used the earth itself. Preserved meats hung from wooden beams like a medieval delicatessen. Salt-cured pork, dried fish, and smoked sausages dangled in the cool, dry air. The constant temperature prevented spoilage while the low humidity stopped mold growth. Your modern refrigerator wishes it could work this efficiently without electricity. Then there were the beverages. Ale barrels dominated many cellars because water wasn't always safe to drink. Families brewed weak ale that even children consumed daily. Wine storage required more finesse. Wealthy families positioned their barrels in the coolest corners, creating the first wine cellars that would make today's sommeliers weep with envy. Archaeological evidence reveals some families stored enough provisions for 6 months or more. Ceramic pots held honey, the medieval equivalent of sugar, while wooden boxes contained precious spices. These weren't just emergency supplies, they represented economic security in an unpredictable world. The organization would shame modern pantry enthusiasts. Everything had its place, from the largest grain barrel to the smallest herb bundle. Families created inventory systems using tally. Sticks or simple markings on walls, they knew exactly what they had and how long it would last. Some cellars included drainage systems made from hollow logs or carved stone channels. Water management separated successful storage from rotting disasters. A flooded cellar meant potential starvation, so medieval builders took moisture control seriously. But storing food was just one piece of the puzzle. These underground spaces served multiple purposes, and their construction required specific techniques that would determine whether families thrived or merely survived the harsh medieval winters. Medieval builders had to work with whatever Mother Nature left lying around. In plains regions, where stone was about as common as a trustworthy politician, people got creative with earth, wood, and straw. These weren't exactly luxury materials, but they got the job done. Think of it like medieval IKEA, except instead of confusing instruction manuals, they had generations of trial and error. And probably fewer arguments with spouses about missing screws. The earthen walls formed the backbone of most dugouts. Workers would pack dirt mixed with clay to create surprisingly solid barriers. This wasn't just throwing mud at a wall and hoping it stuck, though sometimes it literally was. The key lay in layering different soil types, creating a natural composite that could withstand moisture and pressure. Wood provided the structural skeleton. But here's where things get interesting. Medieval builders didn't waste precious timber on hidden underground spaces. Instead, they salvaged bent branches, fallen logs, and wood scraps that wouldn't work for visible construction. Crooked timber that would make a carpenter cringe actually worked perfectly for dugout frameworks. Straw played a surprisingly sophisticated role. Mixed into the earthen walls, it acted like medieval rebar, preventing cracks and adding insulation. Some builders created intricate wattle and daub techniques, weaving thin branches through wooden frames before plastering them with clay and straw mixtures. The genius wasn't in the materials themselves, but in how people combined them. A typical dugout might feature stone foundation corners scavenged from old buildings, wooden support beams from storm-damaged trees, and walls made from local clay mixed with whatever organic matter was available. Hair from animals, dried grass, even food scraps. Everything had potential. Regional variations tell fascinating stories. Northern communities added extra layers of organic insulation, while areas prone to flooding incorporated drainage systems using broken pottery and gravel. Some clever builders even recycled old Roman tiles and bricks, proving that upcycling isn't exactly a modern concept. These material choices reflected both necessity and ingenuity. When your local hardware store is basically whatever's in the forest, you develop serious problem-solving skills. The results weren't pretty, but they worked. And honestly, when you're hiding from raiders or surviving brutal winters underground, aesthetics take a back seat to not freezing to death. Well, having the right materials was only half the battle. The other half? Actually putting these underground havens together with tools that would make today's contractors weep with frustration. Medieval folks didn't exactly have Home Depot on speed dial, so building underground dugouts meant making do with whatever tools they could get their hands on. We're talking about an era when your local hardware store was basically the village blacksmith who probably doubled as the dentist on weekends. The backbone of any dugout project? The humble spade. These weren't your modern ergonomic garden tools with cushioned grips. Think more along the lines of a flat piece of iron hammered onto a wooden handle that could double as a weapon if raiders showed up mid-excavation. Wooden shovels were equally popular, especially for moving loose soil. They were lighter on the arms, but had about the same lifespan as a medieval peasant's dental hygiene routine. Then there were the picks. These bad boys were essentially pointed iron chunks designed to break through stubborn clay and rocky soil. Using one for hours was like doing CrossFit, except your reward wasn't a protein shake. It was not freezing to death come winter. But here's where it gets interesting. Tool quality varied wildly depending on your local blacksmith's skill level. Some villages had craftsmen who could forge tools sharp enough to slice through earth like butter. Others had smiths whose idea of precision was close enough for medieval work. Makes sense, right? The really clever part was how these simple tools could create such complex underground spaces. A skilled digger could carve out storage niches, sleeping alcoves, and even primitive drainage systems using nothing more than basic hand tools. It's like watching someone build a smartphone with a hammer and chisel. Well, not quite that extreme, but you get the idea. Archaeological digs have uncovered some of these original tools, and they're surprisingly well preserved. Iron tools from 700 years ago that still look functional today. Meanwhile, I can't keep a modern shovel from rusting in my garage for 6 months. The durability issue was real, though. A broken spade midwinter could spell disaster for a family trying to expand their shelter. Smart communities kept backup tools and knew how to repair them quickly. The village blacksmith wasn't just a craftsman, he was basically medieval technical support. And here's the weird part. Some of these ancient tools were actually more effective than you'd expect. Their weight and design were perfectly suited for the specific type of digging required underground. But having the right tools was only half the battle. Knowing where to dig, that's where the real expertise came into play. Building a medieval dugout wasn't like throwing a dart at a map and hoping for the best. Location mattered more than a mother-in-law's opinion at a wedding planning meeting. Smart builders knew that picking the wrong spot could turn their cozy shelter into an underground swimming pool faster than you could say medieval plumbing disaster. The key was understanding how water moved through the landscape. Nobody wanted to wake up floating on their sleeping mat because they'd accidentally built their dugout in nature's drainage system. Hillsides were pure gold for dugout construction. Why? Gravity became your best friend. Water naturally flowed down and away from your shelter instead of pooling around it like an unwanted house guest. Plus, digging into a hillside meant you only had to excavate 3 walls instead of 4. Medieval people weren't lazy, but they weren't stupid either. But here's where it gets interesting. The type of soil determined whether your dugout would last decades or collapse faster than a bad joke at a funeral. Clay soil held its shape beautifully, but turned into a slippery nightmare when wet. Sandy soil drained well, but crumbled like stale bread. The sweet spot was a mixture that offered both stability and drainage. Then there's the genius part most people miss. Medieval builders looked for spots where the water table sat deep underground. They didn't have fancy equipment to measure this, so they relied on observation. Areas where trees grew tall and grass stayed green year-round usually meant water lurked close to the surface. These spots got crossed off the list immediately. Smart location choices are also considered wind patterns. Dugouts positioned to avoid prevailing winds stayed warmer and required less fuel for heating. Every piece of firewood saved meant more energy for other survival tasks. Archaeological evidence shows that successful dugouts often clustered in specific geographic zones. These weren't random choices. Medieval communities passed down knowledge about which locations worked and which ones failed spectacularly. Some families probably learned the hard way that building near rivers during dry seasons meant surprise flooding come spring. The most clever builders even considered future expansion. They'd choose sites where additional storage rooms or escape tunnels could be added later. This forward thinking separated the amateur diggers from the underground architects. Well, choosing the perfect location was just the beginning. Once medieval families found their ideal spot, they faced the challenge of actually creating livable spaces underground. But how exactly did they transform a hole in the ground into something resembling a home? Medieval dugout builders weren't content with bare dirt walls and functional holes in the ground. These folks had standards, even when hiding underground like medieval moles. The moment families settled into their subterranean homes, they started making them feel less like tombs and more like cozy retreats. Simple clay paints made from local earth created warm, earthy tones on walls. Red ochre was particularly popular, probably because it reminded people of warmer times above ground when they weren't dodging arrows or freezing their medieval backsides off. But here's where it gets interesting. Carving became the underground art form of choice. Using nothing more than eating knives and basic chisels, families etched personal symbols, family crests, and religious imagery directly into the earthen walls. Well, someone had to keep busy during those long winter months when going outside meant becoming a human popsicle. Some dugouts featured elaborate geometric patterns that would make your grandmother's wallpaper look plain. These weren't random doodles either. Many carvings served practical purposes. Notches marked storage areas, crosses designated prayer corners, and hash marks often tracked days or seasons. Smart thinking for people without calendars on their phones. The really ambitious families created raised relief work, building up clay and mud to form 3-dimensional decorations. Think medieval Pinterest, but with actual mud instead of inspiration boards about farmhouse chic. Then there's the matter of personal touches that archaeologists still discover today. Handprints pressed into clay walls, children's drawings scratched into corners, even primitive family portraits carved with surprising detail. These underground galleries became time capsules of medieval domestic life. What's remarkable is how these decorative efforts transformed psychological spaces. A bare dugout felt like a prison, but add some artwork and suddenly you've got a medieval man cave worth bragging about. The decorations served as conversation starters when neighbors dropped by to wait out raids together. Religious imagery dominated many dugout art collections. Crosses, biblical scenes, and protective symbols covered walls like spiritual insurance policies. Makes sense, right? When you're literally living underground, a little divine protection couldn't hurt. Some families even created primitive murals depicting life above ground, trees, animals, and sunny skies. These served as medieval mood boosters during particularly grim winters when surface life seemed like a distant memory. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain dugouts became neighborhood showcases, with families competing to create the most impressive underground decor. Medieval home and garden magazines would have had a field day, but artistic expression was only part of making these spaces livable. The real challenge came in organizing daily life within cramped quarters where everyone had to function together. Living underground wasn't exactly what you'd call spacious. Medieval dugouts were basically the original studio apartments, everything crammed into one room. But somehow, they made it work. Families ate, slept, and stored their belongings in spaces barely larger than a modern walk-in closet. The design was surprisingly clever, though. Most dugouts featured carved benches along the walls that doubled as beds at night. Think of it as medieval Murphy furniture. Every surface had multiple jobs. These stone or earth benches weren't winning any comfort awards, but they kept people off the cold ground and provided essential seating during meals. Well, speaking of meals, cooking underground presented its own challenges. Families built small hearths near the entrance for ventilation, though smoke management was trickier than a teenager's excuse for missing curfew. The compact space meant everyone gathered around these tiny fires, creating an intimacy that modern families might find suffocating. Storage became an art form in these tight quarters. Medieval families carved niches and alcoves directly into the earthen walls, creating natural shelving for pottery, tools, and preserved foods. Archaeological digs have uncovered everything from cooking pots to children's toys tucked into these wall cavities, suggesting these spaces truly functioned as complete homes. But here's what's fascinating. Even in these cramped conditions, families found ways to express themselves. Simple carvings decorated walls, scratched names marked family territories, and personal belongings were arranged with care. It's like medieval Pinterest, but carved in dirt. The psychological impact of underground living was significant too. Spending weeks or months in these dim, confined spaces during harsh winters or extended sieges tested everyone's patience. Makes sense why archaeological evidence shows many dugouts expanded over time. Cabin fever apparently isn't a modern invention. Temperature control was actually impressive in these spaces. The earth provided natural insulation, maintaining relatively stable temperatures even when surface conditions were brutal. Families often hung textiles or furs to divide sleeping areas, creating privacy zones within the single room. Children grew up in these environments during crisis periods, playing with carved wooden toys and learning survival skills from their elders. Archaeological finds reveal miniature versions of adult tools, suggesting parents prepared their children for underground living from an early age. And the weird part is, many families preferred staying in their dugouts even after immediate threats passed. The practical benefits of consistent temperature and protection from elements made these underground homes surprisingly appealing alternatives to drafty surface dwellings. The ingenuity required for successful underground living reveals just how adaptable medieval communities truly were.